But then finally he takes in that blood and sprinkles it. He goes through the veil. Now remember, none of the other priests have gone through that veil. Not a time. They only went into the first apartment. No one went into the very presence of God except one man, and that was the high priest. And only on this one day of the year, the Day of Atonement, after a lot of preparation and heart searching. But on this day, the high priest,
behind that mysterious veil of the wilderness tabernacle lies some ancient truths which affect every one of us. In his message today, Joe Cruz talks about the priest, the confessional, and his church. Stay tuned for the amazing facts.
Do you remember the Bible account of Jesus leaving the carpenter shop in Nazareth and going out into the desert there to meet John the Baptist? This was probably the first time these cousins had ever met. But as soon as Jesus walked into that circle of listeners, John pointed at him and said, "Behold the Lamb of God that taketh away the sin of the world." Now, friends, why did John call Jesus a lamb? And how could he take away the sins of the world? Now, to get the answer to those questions, we must leave the banks of the Jordan River and go back hundreds of years to the banks of the Red Sea. Now, the Israelites had just come up out of Egypt and were ready to start that long, tedious journey through the wilderness to the Promised Land. And right there, on this occasion, God called Moses up into the mountain, you remember. And he said, "Moses, I want you to make me a sanctuary that I may dwell among them." In other words, God wanted to have a church there with his people Israel as they went through that wilderness. And as they came up to worship him at that place, God would come down and manifest his presence there and would bless the people by his personal presence. And so God said, "Moses, I want you to make it in a certain way according to a certain pattern." And up on this mountain, God opened up the great heavenly sanctuary. In fact, Moses was privileged to look right into the throne room of God, and he saw the holy place and the most holy place of the heavenly sanctuary. And God said, "Now this is what you are to copy. You're to make this earthly sanctuary after this pattern that I've showed to you." And so when Moses came off that mountain, friends, he had all the specifications with him, the details of material and measurements and everything else. And he quickly called together all of the skillful artisans and craftsmen of Israel and laid before them this plan that God had given for building a structure, a church, a sanctuary, if you please, that they were to carry along with them through the wilderness as they traveled. Now, this building was a portable building made of lightweight materials that could easily be fitted together and dismantled. And as the people traveled, they could come here and worship God, and then later as they moved on to another place, why they could take this down, you know, and move it right along with them as they travel. Made mostly out of the skins of animals and very lightweight portable materials. Now, after it was all completed, a great cloud of glory came down to rest over that building and to show that God was pleased with it. He approved of what they had done. He accepted it. Now I want you to see exactly what that building looked like. And I'm asking my colleague here, Brother Jim, to make a little drawing on the board of what that building was like, the general layout of it. Now the main building was inside a courtyard. There was a fence around the outside with an open courtyard, and then the main building was inside. And that main building was about 45 feet by 15 feet. And it was divided into two rooms, actually. The first was called the Holy Place, and the other was called the Most Holy Place. Now, this entire structure and courtyard faced the east. Now, there's a very good reason for this. You remember that those people worshiped the sun back in those days, Baal worship, and folks were always looking toward the east and worshiping the sun as it came up. Well, now God had his sanctuary facing the east so that when his people came in to worship him, their backs would be to the east, you see, just the opposite of what the pagan people were doing around them. Now let's look at the articles of furniture in this sanctuary. When they walked into the outer court, there was an altar of burnt offering out there that the people would come to bring their animal sacrifices. So the altar of burnt offering, and then there was a laver just before going inside where the priests could wash as they went in to carry the blood of the animals. Now, as you went into the sanctuary, the first apartment called the holy place, there were 3 articles of furniture. On the right, as you went in, was the table of showbread. 12 loaves of bread kept fresh there on that table, representing Jesus, the bread of life. On the left side was a 7-pronged candlestick, representing Jesus as the light of the world. And in front of this heavy veil, now remember, there was a heavy veil separating these 2 apartments between the holy and the most holy, hanging from the top right down to the very bottom. In front of that veil was the golden altar of incense, where the incense went up before God, representing the prayers of the saints as well as the righteousness of Christ. Now, moving through that heavy veil into the next room called the most holy place, or the Holy of Holies, there was just 1 article of furniture, and that was the Ark of the Covenant. Now, please don't misunderstand me when I say that. Some people think that I'm talking about Noah's Ark. No, this is the Ark of the Covenant, which was a heavy box or chest in which were found, you remember, the 10 Commandments, the tables of the law, Aaron's rod that budded, and the golden pot of manna. These were the things inside. Now, on top of this Ark of the Covenant was the mercy seat. And then on either end of the ark, arching out over the mercy seat, were the 2 cherubims with their wings covering over the top of the mercy seat. Now, that was called the mercy seat because this represented the very throne of God in heaven. And a bright spot of shining glory was manifested there between those cherubim. And that was called the Shekinah glory because it symbolized the very presence and power of God. Now, friends, that was the most sacred place to be found anywhere on earth because it represented the place where God would come and meet His people as they travel through the wilderness. So you can understand the sanctity and the holiness of this particular place. But I wanted you to see here a general overall picture of what this sanctuary looked like as the Israelites traveled on their way. Now, some very interesting things took place in that sanctuary as they worshiped God from time to time. Let me explain to you now what happened as the people would come to get forgiveness of sins. You see, this church in the wilderness, friends, provided a way for those Old Testament Hebrew people to get their sins forgiven. How did they do it? They did it by faith. They did it through faith in Jesus. But you see, Jesus was represented back there by a lamb. And so the people were asked to bring a lamb. Every time they sinned, they would come with this lamb and put it on this altar, confess their sin over that spotless animal. It had to be absolutely without any flaw or blemish because it represented Jesus. And they'd confess their sin over it. Then with their own hand, they would kill that animal. Well, you say, Brother Joe, that's a terrible thing. What an awful experience to have to pass through. Coming in there with a knife and slaying that innocent little lamb. Yes, indeed, friends, that was a traumatic thing. But what was the purpose of it? To impress on those people that sin means death. Isn't that right? When they sinned, it meant death. Either they would have to die for their sins, or else that sin would have to be transferred onto the Lamb who represented Jesus, the spotless Son of God, who would be coming later and give His life as an atoning sacrifice. So when they came with their animal, they also confessed their sin over it. They killed that animal. The priest then would catch the blood and take it inside that holy place and sprinkle it there before the veil in the upon the altar in that holy place. Now, friends, this represents the transfer of the guilt from that person who comes to confess his sin onto the animal, and then through the blood, the sin is transferred into the sanctuary. You get the idea now? The sin is transferred to the animal, then to the priest, and then through the sprinkled blood, a record was made of that in the sanctuary. And that record remained there all year long. You see, this kind of a service went on day after day after day. People were coming, bringing their lambs, killing those animals, confessing their sins. The sins transferred to the animal, then to the priest, and then into the sanctuary. And there a record was made day after day. Now, one day a year, they had a service called the cleansing of the sanctuary. And this is when that record of sin in there was to be taken care of. It was to be blotted out on that day, called the Day of Atonement. You remember that day, friends, when they had all of those special solemn services? And even to this very day, That is one of the most holy days of Judaism. In fact, it is a day of judgment. Today it's called Yom Kippur. It comes, I believe, in the month of October, and it is the most holy, sacred day as far as the Jew is concerned. Because that day is the day of judgment. That's the cleansing of the sanctuary. That's when those sins, that record of sin is going to be taken care of. Now, friends, I want to impress upon you the solemn events that took place on this special day of atonement. I mean, for days the people got ready for this. They prayed, they searched their hearts. They made certain there was no unclean thing in their houses or in their hearts. And then on this day, after much prayer and solemn searching of heart, the high priest would come into this courtyard, bringing 2 goats. And by the way, that high priest had spent a lot of time in searching his own heart, because he now is going in there before God to represent all the people of Israel. He has 2 goats. Now, one of those goats is to be the Lord's goat, and the other is to be the scapegoat. You've heard of the scapegoat, haven't you? He cast lots on these 2 animals. The one that falls out to be the Lord's goat, he places on that altar, confesses the sins of Israel over it, his own sins and the sins of Israel, and then kills that goat, takes the blood and goes into the sanctuary. Now, he goes in 2 or 3 times that day. I'm not going into all of the times that he went in there. First with his censer in order to fill the place with the incense and to hide the glory of God from him. But then finally he takes in that blood and sprinkles it. He goes through the veil. Now, remember, none of the other priests have gone through that veil. Not a time. They only went into the first apartment. No one went into the very presence of God except one man, and that was the high priest. And only on this one day of the year, the Day of Atonement, after a lot of preparation and heart searching. But on this day, the high priest goes through that heavy veil, sprinkles that blood right on the mercy seat over the broken law, and makes atonement for the people, blotting out their sins that have been recorded in there through that sprinkled blood. And by the way, while he's in there, the people are outside in an attitude of great fear and prayer. In fact, tradition tells us that they had a rope tied to the foot of that high priest when he went in there, because if he had any sin in his heart, he would have been struck down there before the ark of God in the presence of God. And so there was a rope tied to his foot in case he was struck down in there. Nobody could go in to get him. Nobody could remove that body, and they would just have to pull his body out. And so it was, you can understand the preparations that were made, the fine details, to be certain that everything was being done according to the Word of God and the will of God. Now, after coming out of the place where he has made atonement for the people by sprinkling that blood, the high priest comes to the scapegoat. Now, what does the scapegoat represent? Well, friends, there's no question about it that it represents Satan. Now, you're going to wonder, well, now what does Satan have to do with this special solemn service of the atonement and blotting out of sins? Well, let me explain, friends. The things that take place in this sanctuary on this day represents the final disposition of sin. It is all symbolic. It is all pointing forward to something that's going to happen in the real sanctuary up in heaven with the real high priest up there ministering, which is Jesus Christ. So it all represents the final disposition of sin as it affects every person in this world, on this planet. And so sin is going to come back to where it belongs, and punishment is going to be given where it is supposed to be given. And finally, the world and the universe are going to be cleansed of all sin. So all the things that take place in here represent the final acts of God in disposing of the sin problem and in seeing that it's all atoned for or punished. So, after the high priest comes out on this day, he goes over to the scapegoat and places his hands upon him. You may say, well, Brother Joe, why does he come out there as though he's placing sins here on this scapegoat? Well, now, friends, and what happens after he does this? The scapegoat is led off into the wilderness by the hand of a fit man and left out there to perish alone. Now, I don't have time to read all these texts right now because this is merely laying the foundation and giving a little background to help us understand the great prophecy of Daniel 8 and 9. But when he puts his hand on the scapegoat, he's led off into the wilderness, left out there to perish alone. There's no shedding of blood on the part of the scapegoat. He could not represent Jesus because Jesus always is symbolized by the blood being shed. This goat does not shed his blood at all. He's taken off out there with a load of sin on him and left out there to perish with that upon him. And he's not killed, or his blood is not shed. Now, why does this happen, friends? I'll tell you why. I'll tell you why. Because Satan is involved in every sin that's ever been committed. He has caused everybody to sin. He was a participant in every sin. In fact, every sin admits of shared responsibility, doesn't it? Now let's use an example. Let's say that a man and a woman here have sinned. Let's say they did it back in Israel. Let's go back to Israel's time now and think in terms of a sin that has been committed. This sin has three partners in it. The man and the woman, let's say they've committed adultery. And then there's the devil, who also took part in it, didn't he? He tempted them. He led them into it. He caused them to sin too. So he bears a share, my friends, in the sins of every person that sins, because he is the one who entices and shares in it. So let's say then that these three parties have a share in this sin. Let's say that the woman brings a lamb, puts her hand on that animal, confesses her sin, kills the animal. The blood is taken into the sanctuary. What happens to her guilt then? What happens to her record of sin? On the Day of Atonement, when the high priest goes in there and sprinkles that blood, my friends, her guilt in that sin is atoned for. All right? Now, she will not have to die, because Christ has died for her, and she's had faith by bringing that lamb and showing her faith in the death of Jesus. Let's say that the man never comes to bring a lamb. So what happens to him? Why, friends, on this day, the Day of Atonement, if his sin has not been confessed and the blood hasn't been sprinkled in there, this is the end for him. That's the end of his probation. He is cut off from Israel without any hope. You see, this is the Day of Judgment. And it was looked upon that way. And anybody whose sin was not under the blood on this day was lost. They were put out of the camp of Israel and separated from God. And so that man would have to bear his own guilt, his own share of guilt in that sin. All right, what about Satan then, friends, and his participation in that sin? Why, he is going to also have to bear an ultimate punishment for all sin, isn't he? And that is what is represented here by the rolling back upon him of these sins by the high priest, and then he's led off into the wilderness there to perish alone, representing Satan during the millennium, at the end of which he is going to perish, as we'll find in our next study together. But there it is, the final disposition of every sin. Finally, those who confess Jesus and have faith in him, they will escape, and the blood of Jesus and the death of Jesus will atone for their guilt. Those who do not come and confess Christ will have to bear that in their own body. They'll be cut off themselves and have to pay the penalty by their own death. And Satan is going to bear his share of guilt and the sin of every person who has ever sinned. And so all of that is symbolized here in this picture of what happens on the Day of Atonement. Now, friends, this gives us a little background upon which we're going to be building, the foundation of which we're going to be building as we move on into this great prophecy of Daniel and Revelation. Don't forget what happens on the Day of Atonement. That is the cleansing of the sanctuary. That is absolutely, friends, the judgment day for all people. So don't forget that as we move now into the book of Daniel. Come back with me to Daniel chapter 8. And we shall begin reading some very interesting things from the writings of the prophet Daniel. Verse 1, chapter 8 of Daniel. In the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared unto me, even unto me Daniel, after that which appeared unto me at the first. And I saw in a vision, and it came to pass when I saw that I was at Shushan in the palace, which is in the province of Elam, and I saw in a vision, and I was by the river of Ulai. Now let's get a little background on this, friends. Daniel is in captivity. He's over in Babylon. He's been carried away with all of the choice young men of Jerusalem when Babylon came over there to fight against them, you remember. And for almost 70 years they have been in captivity. Daniel serving right there in the palace of the king of Babylon. And so we look in on him here in chapter 8 of Daniel, serving in the palace of the king of Babylon. And he has a vision at this time. Now we're very interested in knowing what God is saying to this young man, who is a captive of war in the palace of the king of Babylon. Let's read on in verse 3. Notice what happens. Then I lifted up mine eyes and saw. And behold, there stood before the river a ram which had 2 horns. And the 2 horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher came up last. Now you're going to have to use your imagination a little bit on this part of the vision. He sees an animal, and it's a ram, and it's got 2 horns, and one was higher than the other, and the highest horn came up last. Now let's read on and see what happens. I saw the ram pushing westward and northward and southward, so that no beast might stand before him, neither was there any that could deliver out of his hand. But he did according to his will and became great. Here's this animal now, pushing in every direction, conquering everything that gets in its way, and being a great victor over all enemies. Now let's look and see what happens in verse 5. And as I was considering, behold, a he-goat came from the west on the face of the whole earth, and touched not the ground. And the goat had a notable horn between his eyes. And he came to the ram that had 2 horns, which I'd seen standing before the river, and ran unto him in the fury of his power. And I saw him come close unto the ram, and he was moved with choler against him, and smote the ram, and brake his 2 horns. And there was no power in the ram to stand before him, but he cast him down to the ground, and stamped upon him, and there was none that could deliver the ram out of his hand. Therefore the he-goat waxed very great. And when he was strong, the great horn was broken, and for it came up 4 notable ones toward the 4 winds of heaven. Now I hope you follow me on that, friends. Let's review briefly now what he sees. 2 animals. The ram here with 2 horns, the highest one coming up last. And then here's a he-goat coming with a great horn between his eyes, and he runs into this ram and breaks his 2 horns and tramples him down, and then the he-goat becomes very, very great. And when he's strong, it says the great horn was broken, and 4 other horns came up to take the place of it. Who do these animals represent? Drop down now to verses 20 and 21. Let's read the angel Gabriel's interpretation of this dream or vision as he tells Daniel exactly what these animals stand for. The ram which thou sawest, having 2 horns, are the kings of Media and Persia. All right, friends, this is the Second World Empire, isn't it? Babylon was first, and it was ruling the country right then, ruling the world at that time. And Daniel is being shown that Babylon will be going down, and Medo-Persia will be coming up as a Second World Empire. All right, who was it that came and destroyed or conquered Medo-Persia? Who was the he-goat? Verse 21 says, and the rough goat is the king of Grecia. And the great horn that is between his eyes is the first king. Well, here's the Third World Empire, the Grecian Empire coming up. And who was that first king of Greece? Who? Alexander the Great, of course, you remember? Represented by the leopard beast in Daniel 7 with 4 wings, the tremendous speed, and it says here that he comes not even touching the ground. You see, he was coming so fast he didn't even touch the ground. And that's equivalent to those 4 wings of the other beast. And he runs into the ram that represented Medo-Persia and breaks his horns, conquers him, and then he becomes very great and begins to rule over the earth. And when he was strong, the great horn was broken. What does that represent? Well, that's the death of Alexander. Remember, he died as a young man. And then his kingdom was divided among his 4 generals, Cassander, Lysimachus, Seleucus, and Ptolemy. So here we are now, actually brought to the end of the Babylonian Empire, the end of the Medo-Persian Empire, and we're right into the time of the Grecian Empire, according to the vision that Daniel has.
There's a place in the back of my mind, a little corner that's reserved for all time. It's home, sweet home, precious memories, oh so far. There's just some things I cannot leave behind, and I still love you, Lord, in the same old-fashioned way. And I know that I could
says I've changed. Well, I guess, and so have you. But as time